So, in the last few lectures, we have talked about Aristotle's own specific virtues, the virtues that he lists. We've kind of zoomed in more closely and looked at the details of his theory. So, in this lecture, I want to kind of zoom back out and kind of assess Aristotle's own brand of virtue ethics as a whole. Talk about some of the issues it faces. And in the last lecture, remember, I've said Aristotle's isn't the only form of virtue ethics. In the last lecture, I want to talk about just some advantages and disadvantages of this whole virtue theory approach to ethics. Not just Aristotle's form of virtue ethics, but virtue ethics in general. So one thing to notice about virtue ethics, and we touched on this in the last lecture, is that virtue ethics sets a very high bar. Aristotle says, just to be virtuous is very hard. And remember, this comes in matters of degree. There's virtuous and then there's, ideally virtuous. To be perfectly virtuous, Aristotle says, might be something that no human being has. It might be sort of godlike. Well, what do you think of this? Well, on the one hand, I think there's something good about this. A moral theory should give us something to strive for. It should give us an ideal, and virtue theory seems to do very well with that. We can always be more virtuous even if we may never reach the ideal of being perfectly virtuous. Virtue theory would say, well, work harder, put yourself further up this sort of ladder, right? That seems very inspiring to me. That seems good. On the other hand, if virtue theory sets the bar so high and we're so far below it, well, how useful will the theory be for us? Virtue theorists will say, remember in the last lecture, I said that, well, to have any one virtue, you have to some degree, have all of them. Well, very few people will qualify then, right? And think of also what I said a few lectures ago when comparing this to Kant. To be virtuous, you not only need to do the right thing, you need to feel the right way about it. Put those two together, and I think you'll realize practically no one, very, very, very few people are really virtuous. Well, the virtue theorists might say, well, yeah, I'll admit that, but virtue is an ideal. Even if you're not virtuous, you can work to be more virtuous. Here's the problem, though. If most of us aren't virtuous, is it very helpful to think about what an ideally virtuous person would do? Is it very helpful to think about these idealized virtues? Virtue theory insists, well, if you want to know what the right thing to do is, think of these virtues, and if you want to know what the virtues require, think of what the virtuous person would do. Okay, fine, good. But think of it this way, right? Imagine that I want to know how to run a half marathon or a marathon. I just want to know how to finish this, get a decent time, not kill myself or hurt myself. Well, look, if you said, well, what you ought to do is to look at the guy who won, who holds the world record for running a marathon, do exactly what he does or try to do it as close as possible to what he does, that would almost certainly be terrible advice. Either, if I look at it, I couldn't do it, so I'd either have to try to adapt it to myself, or if I did try to do it, well, I'd probably hurt myself, right? Some 20-year-old who's been training his entire life to run a marathon, what he does is not a very good model for a 40-year-old person who's let himself get out of shape. And in the same way, if we're not, most of us, virtuous, thinking about what the ideally virtuous person would do, thinking about these idealized virtues, might not be terribly helpful. Let me give you an example. Imagine this. You know, you are playing tennis with someone who is just a real pain in the neck. He's a friend of yours or she's a friend, and they just love to make fun of you when you don't do well, right? There's some people this is their whole way of playing a sport, right? To basically just give you a hard time until you stress out and don't do well, right? I had a friend in grad school, my friend Dan, he's actually who I'm thinking of here. This was his whole way of doing it, right? I never played tennis with him, I played chess with him. Just try to get on your nerves, right? Well, so imagine that you play a game of tennis with him and you lose, and he's been giving you a hard time the whole game. Well, you know that the ideally virtuous person would go up to the net, master his temper, be magnanimous, shake his hand, and say, very, very good game, Dan. Well played. I'll try better next time, right? But you know that when you go up there, he's likely to say some final little dig, and you know maybe your temper isn't this bad, but let's just imagine it is. You know that given your own temper, there's a good chance you're going to bash him in the head with a racket, right? So you know that the ideally virtuous person, the man of good temper and proper pride, would go up and shake his hand. You know, good temper, you should have your temper controlled. Proper pride, you shouldn't be so arrogant that you can't accept a loss. That's what you would do if you were virtuous. But knowing that you're not virtuous, you know that there's a good chance you'd bash him in the head with a racket. If you try to do what the ideally virtuous person would do here, there's a very good chance it will lead you wrong. You'll end up hitting your friend in the head with a racket because you're not ideally virtuous. What the ideally virtuous person would do might not be a lot of help to the rest of us who aren't ideally virtuous. So you might say, virtue ethics in setting the bar so high is unrealistic, and the fact it's unrealistic makes it not terribly helpful for the rest of us. A moral theory, this charge might say a moral theory like Kantianism or utilitarianism that gives you clearer guidelines, or natural law theory might be better here. And this brings me back to another point about Kant. Aristotle's claim that we need to feel the right thing as well as do the right thing, that sounds very nice. But keep in mind, it is extremely hard to even do the right thing. If you really need money and you find a wallet with $1,000 in it, it's hard enough to call that person up and return the wallet. To feel the right way about it, to be happy that you are generous and honest and just, that seems unrealistic, right? If your king or your dictator asks you to lie against a political opponent and threatens to kill you if you don't, it's hard enough to do the right thing, Kant would say. It's hard enough to be honest, to feel the right way about it, to be happy that you are a courageous person who wouldn't sacrifice your honor as you're getting your head chopped off. Who could do that? Maybe some saints and heroes, but who else, right? And if Aristotle sets the bar so high, if it's so unrealistic, well, how good is the theory going to be for us then? And I think this gets you down to the fundamental disagreement between Kantian moral theory and Aristotle's version of virtue theory. Kant would say, yes, Aristotle, this all sounds nice. This all makes us feel wonderful when we talk about it, but human nature just isn't up to it. You have a high and unrealistic view of human nature. My theory that focuses on rules and duty is more realistic about what humans are actually capable of. Now remember, Kant didn't want to focus on human nature when coming up with the moral rules, but Kant would say, when you talk about how they apply to human nature, well, then you have to take into account what we're actually like. You know, if we were gods or angels, then we might be happy to do the right thing in all circumstances and just automatically do it in the way Aristotle thinks. Kant thinks that that's unrealistic and that sticking with an unrealistic fiction like that will not be helpful. I don't know who's right here. My own views on human nature and what's possible, probably closer to Kant than Aristotle, but I don't know. Maybe Kant's just too pessimistic. Maybe we should go with Aristotelian optimism and aspiration. I don't know. But I do think there is a real worry here. Another feature of Aristotle, and I think again this cuts both ways, is that Aristotle thinks of doing the right thing as a matter of knowing how. Well, what do I mean by that? Well, think about it this way, right? Think about learning to drive a manual transmission car. Remember this whole thing I talked about with virtues as skills. I could explain to you in detail how to do it. And my dad explained to me in detail how to do it. And I messed up. You can know all the rules for driving a manual transmission car, you won't be able to do it. You can know all the rules for, say, cooking a pot roast. You probably won't be able to do it, right? You can certainly know all the rules for hitting a curveball. As I've sadly found out many times in my life, that doesn't make you able to hit a curveball, right? So Aristotle would say, things like driving a manual transmission car, hitting a curveball, cooking well, dancing, singing, any of this stuff is a matter of knowing how. It's not just a matter of knowing some set of rules. That's a matter of knowing that. Well, I think there's something to that, right? Doing the right thing does seem like a skill. It does seem like a matter of knowing how. It doesn't seem like you can capture it in some set of rules. That seems right to me. There seems to be something to that. But there's also something dangerous in this whole approach. Look, if you're asking somebody who is an expert, who's a great batter, why he does something, he might not be able to explain it to you, right? If you ask somebody who can really play the piano why he hits this note and then that, why he plays the way he does, if you can't even read music, he won't be able to explain it to you satisfyingly, right? It's a matter of skill. Well, the problem here, though, is if you think of doing the right thing, if you think of virtues in the same way, it kind of gives people an excuse to cut off the conversation. Oh, it's just a matter of having the skill, it's just a matter of knowing what the virtuous thing is and doing it. I couldn't explain it to you if you're not virtuous. That seems a cop-out. On the other hand, there does seem to be something to be said to be able to appeal to these moral rules to explain, to justify what you're doing. And I'll give you an example of how this pops up. There's a famous philosopher, Elizabeth Anscombe, very, very bright woman, but she was a virtue theorist, one of the people who really made virtue theory popular in modern philosophy. And Anscombe had a bad habit when she couldn't justify one of her own moral judgments, should just say, well, you can't, if you don't get it, you can't justify it, right? She famously said, utilitarians were arguing against her virtue theory approach. They were differing on an issue. And Anscombe just says, well, one doesn't know how to argue with bad people. She was also British. So her thought was, the utilitarians, they just don't have the virtues, they just don't have the skills, they won't get it, we don't need to talk to them. That's really dangerous in moral reasoning, right? That you can just shut people down like that, to say, well, you just don't get it, there's nothing that I could appeal to that would make you get it, right? That seems to be a real danger with virtue theory. Now, the virtue theorist will say, we can always appeal to virtues like courage or, honesty, so on and so forth. Well, but that will only get you so far, right? If the other person says, well, I don't see why that's the honest thing to do, well, what can the virtue theorist say besides, well, it is. I have the skill, or if you had the skill, you'd see that this is what honesty requires. No more to be said. One final note here. Aristotle thinks, he's very clear about this, and this is part of this idea that what he said about proper pride. He thinks that different people have different levels of moral expertise. And Aristotle would say, obviously there is something to this. Think about this, if you want to know what the right thing to do is, you're going to trust some of your friends more than others. There is a person you would ask for good moral advice. There are other people who you wouldn't trust in a million years. I'm betting you can even think of people, right? You might ask people in the last group if you wanted to get somebody to tell you what you want to hear, but if you really wanted to know the right thing, there are some people you would ask, there are other people you wouldn't, right? And Aristotle would say that very fact shows you that some people are better at morality, some people have a moral expertise, other people don't. Now, there's something to that, but again, that should worry us, right? This idea that some people just have more moral skill. It should worry us because I think, it seems to get some people off the hook for explaining and justifying what they do. It seems to open up a sort of cop-out. And again, if we think Aristotle has an unrealistically high view of human nature, well, then there's a real danger that we might think that we have this incredible level of moral expertise when we don't. And that comes back to this idea that maybe humility is a virtue, right? At any rate, so I know this is a lot of criticism of virtue theory. I know this is a sort of high-level view. I just want to make you aware of the sort of issues, both the merits and the problems with Aristotle's particular form of virtue theory.